The laugh wasn't loud, but it spread fast. It moved across the room like permission, telling everyone it was safe to judge me. I remember lowering my eyes and realizing something worse than embarrassment was happening. They thought I was weak, and they thought they were right. Before I go any further, let me say this. If you've ever asked for help and felt smaller because of it, you'll understand this story. And if stories like this matter to you, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss what comes next. Some moments don't break you right away. They wait. It happened during class, on a day that felt ordinary enough to lower your guard. The room was loud in that restless way classrooms get before a lesson really begins. Chairs scraping, papers shuffling, conversations overlapping just enough to feel chaotic without crossing a line. I sat near the middle, not trying to stand out, not trying to disappear either, just present. That had always been my balance. The assignment was handed out, and I scanned the page slowly. I understood most of it, but one section didn't sit right with me. Not confusing exactly, just off. The kind of thing that turns into a bigger problem if you pretend you understand it when you don't. So I did something simple. I raised my hand. The teacher hadn't even looked up yet when I heard it. A soft laugh. Familiar. Too familiar. My cousin sat 2 rows over. Same last name, same family gatherings, same way of always knowing how to sound confident even when he wasn't. He leaned back in his chair, smirked, and said just loud enough for people nearby to hear, "You don't get it already?" A few heads turned. Someone else chuckled. I felt heat rise in my face, but I kept my hand raised. The teacher glanced over. "Yes?" "I just wanted to make sure I'm approaching this part the right way," I said. My voice stayed calm. I made sure of that. Before the teacher could respond, my cousin shook his head. "It's not that hard," he said. "You just follow the steps. Everyone else gets it." That one landed differently, not because it was allowed, but because it was framed as fact. The teacher paused, looked between us, then nodded slowly. "Let me see something first." She turned back to her desk. The room settled into an uneasy quiet. Not silence exactly, but attention, the kind that feels heavier than noise. I lowered my hand and stared at the paper in front of me. My cousin leaned to the person next to him and whispered something. I didn't hear the words, but I heard the laughter. I focused on breathing. This wasn't the first time. He'd always been like this, quick to mock, quicker to perform confidence. At family events, he was the one telling stories, exaggerating achievements, correcting people loudly. I was the one listening. At least, that's what everyone assumed. The teacher flipped through a few pages on her desk. Then she looked up again. She said my name. Just my name, nothing else. The room went completely still. That's when I knew something had shifted. I looked up, confused at first. She was watching me closely now, not with curiosity, but with intention. "Can you come up here for a moment?" she asked. My cousin straightened in his chair. I stood, my legs feeling heavier than they should have, and walked to the front of the room. Each step felt louder than the last, though I knew that was just my own awareness filling the silence. The teacher handed me a marker. "Show us how you would approach it," she said. "Not explain, not answer, approach." I glanced back at my desk, then at the board. I took a breath and started writing, slowly, clearly, the way I always did when I wanted to be understood instead of rushed. I didn't look back while I worked. I heard chairs shift. Someone whispered something, then stopped. The marker squeaked faintly against the board as I finished the last step and capped it. The teacher nodded. "That's correct," she said. "And that question you asked, it was the right one." She turned to the class. "This is why asking for help matters. Understanding the process is more important than pretending you already know it." I felt eyes on my back when I walked to my seat.
My cousin didn't laugh this time. I sat down, heart steady now, not racing. The moment had passed, but it hadn't ended, because that wasn't what made the room silent. The silence came afterward, when the teacher added, "And for the record, he's been consistently one of the strongest students in this class." No one said anything. I glanced sideways. My cousin was staring at his paper, jaw tight. That should have been enough. For most people, it would have been a small win, a moment of quiet satisfaction. But for me, it unlocked something else, because his reaction wasn't embarrassment, it was anger. And anger doesn't fade quietly. For the rest of the class, I felt it. Sharp looks, exaggerated sighs, the tension of someone whose image had been cracked in front of witnesses. I kept my focus forward, writing notes, pretending nothing had changed, but I knew better. Because when people feel exposed, they don't reflect, they retaliate. And I had a feeling this wasn't going to end in the classroom. It was going to follow us home. Because what my cousin didn't know, what he had never bothered to know, was that I hadn't raised my hand because I was unsure. I had raised it because I was paying attention, and that difference was about to matter far more than he realized, as everything quietly began moving toward the moment when mocking me for asking for help would become the biggest mistake he ever made.
The rest of the day passed with an uncomfortable calm, not the peaceful kind, more like the air before a storm that never announces itself. My cousin avoided looking at me, but I could feel his awareness like pressure. He tapped his pen harder than necessary, shifted in his chair too often. Confidence, when it's performative, doesn't recover well from interruption. When the bell rang, chairs scraped back and conversations resumed, but something had changed. A few people glanced at me differently now, not impressed, just recalibrating, like they were adjusting a picture they'd been looking at the wrong way. My cousin stood up quickly and left without a word. That was new. At home, nothing looked different. Same hallway, same quiet hum of the house. My parents asked how school was, and I gave the usual answer, fine, normal. They didn't push. They trusted me enough to know I'd speak if it mattered. I went to my room and sat at my desk, replaying the moment, not with pride, but with curiosity. The teacher hadn't planned that. I knew she hadn't. She'd noticed something and acted on it. That kind of authority isn't about control, it's about observation. And observation was something I'd been practicing for a long time. My cousin and I had grown up around each other, same holidays, same expectations, but somewhere along the way, he decided his confidence made him smarter, louder meant better, faster meant right. I'd learned something else, that most people don't mind being wrong as long as they aren't seen being wrong. The next morning, I noticed a shift before I even sat down. My cousin arrived early, sat straighter, talked louder than usual. He answered questions without raising his hand, cutting off the teacher once before catching himself. He was compensating. That's how I knew the moment had stayed with him. During group work, he made a point of correcting others, explaining things no one asked him to explain. When someone disagreed, he laughed it off like it was obvious they were missing something. I didn't engage. Silence can be unsettling when someone expects resistance. At lunch, he sat with his friends and spoke just loudly enough for me to hear about how some people get lucky, about teachers who play favorites, about how asking questions doesn't mean you understand anything. I ate quietly. What he didn't realize was that this wasn't about the assignment anymore, or the class, or even me. It was about control. He needed the room to go back to the way it was, to the version where he spoke and others nodded, where I stayed quiet and invisible. But rooms don't reset once everyone's seen what they missed. That afternoon, the teacher announced a project, a longer one, group-based, with presentations at the end. She read out the groups. My cousin's name came up, then mine. Together. I felt the shift immediately. A few looks. Someone raised their eyebrows. My cousin froze for half a second before forcing a smile. "Looks like we're working together," he he said, like it was a joke. I nodded. Looks like it. We met after school in the library, sat across from each other on a long table, books open, laptops closed, no distractions to hide behind. He started talking immediately, laid out a plan, told me which part he'd handle, which part I could take care of. He spoke quickly, confidently, like he always did when he didn't want to be interrupted. I listened until he finished. Then I asked one question. Why are you structuring it that way? He blinked. Because that's how it makes sense. I nodded slowly. It might, but it also creates a gap right here. I pointed, not at a page or a screen, but at the idea itself, at the assumption underneath it. He frowned. No, it doesn't. I didn't argue. I explained, calmly, step by step, the way I always did when I wasn't trying to win, just trying to be accurate. Halfway through, he stopped tapping his pen. By the time I finished, he was quiet. That's not what I was thinking, he said. I know, that's why I asked. Something in his expression shifted, not anger this time, something closer to uncertainty. We worked for another hour, more evenly than I expected. He still talked more than I did, but he listened now, occasionally, carefully. When we finished, he packed up without much comment. As we stood to leave, he said, "You didn't have to make me look bad yesterday." I looked at him. I didn't. He scoffed. You know what I mean. I asked a question, that's all. He didn't respond. Over the next few days, the dynamic between us stayed tense but controlled. He stopped mocking me openly, started watching his tone, but I could feel the resentment underneath, the need to regain ground. And that's when the betrayal started to take shape. Not loudly, not obviously, subtly. He began taking credit during check-ins, using we selectively, framing ideas like they'd come from him first, correcting me in front of others in small ways that sounded helpful but weren't. I noticed. Of course I did. But I didn't confront him because I wasn't interested in winning a conversation. I was interested in letting him reveal a pattern. During one class discussion, the teacher asked about a point we'd worked on together. My cousin answered confidently, slightly off, not wrong enough to be challenged immediately, just enough to matter later. The teacher nodded, then looked at me. Do you agree? I paused, just long enough. I think there's another way to look at it, I said, and I explained, simply, clearly, without mentioning him. The teacher smiled. Yes, that's the distinction I was hoping someone would make. I felt the air change again. My cousin stared straight ahead. After class, he didn't wait for me. That night, I thought about how easily people confuse confidence with credibility, how betrayal doesn't always come from cruelty. Sometimes it comes from fear of losing the version of yourself everyone else believes in. And I realized something important. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He was trying to protect himself. But protection built on dismissal doesn't hold up for long, especially not when someone you underestimated stops playing along. The presentation was coming up soon, the moment when everything we'd worked on would be visible, public, interpreted. My cousin thought he was ready. What he didn't know was that the teacher had been paying attention for much longer than either of us realized, and when she finally called my name again, it wouldn't be to ask for help, it would be to ask for the truth, right in front of everyone who had laughed the first time. The day of the presentation arrived without ceremony, no tension in the air that anyone could point to, no obvious signs that something was about to change, just the usual buzz of a classroom pretending it was calm. Desks were rearranged, the projector hummed softly, groups whispered final adjustments to each other. My cousin was confident again, not the loud confidence from before, but something tighter, controlled. He rehearsed his opening under his breath, straightened his notes, adjusted his posture like he was preparing for a performance he'd already imagined winning. I sat beside him, quiet as always. When our group was called, we walked to the front together. He started speaking immediately, voice smooth, practiced, just a little too polished. He explained the concept broadly, hit the key terms, moved through the structure we discussed. People nodded. Then he transitioned to the core idea, the part we'd spent the most time refining, the part where precision mattered. That's where he drifted, not dramatically, just enough. A small assumption slipped in, a shortcut disguised as confidence. Most people wouldn't have noticed.
That was the problem. He kept talking, building on it, stacking certainty on top of something unstable. I watched the teacher's face. She didn't interrupt. She never did when she wanted to see how far someone would go. My cousin reached the end of his section and turned slightly toward me, signaling it was my turn. There was a flicker in his eyes. Not fear, not exactly. Expectation. He assumed I'd support what he'd said, smooth it over, protect the flow. I stood. I didn't correct him immediately. I started where the idea should have started. Calm, grounded. I walked through the logic step by step, not referencing his words directly, but realigning the concept itself. I didn't say he was wrong, I just said what was accurate. Halfway through, I felt it, that shift again, the room leaning in. I finished and stepped back. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the teacher nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said. "That clarification matters." She turned to the class. This is a good example of how understanding isn't just about presenting confidently. It's about knowing where the assumptions are and being willing to question them. My cousin's jaw tightened. The presentation continued, but something had changed. When it ended, the applause was polite, uneven, not dismissive, but thoughtful. We returned to our seats. My cousin didn't look at me. After class, the teacher asked me to stay behind, just me. The room emptied gradually. Chairs scraped, bags zipped, conversations spilled into the hallway. My cousin left without a word. When the door closed, the room felt different, quieter, intentional. "I want to ask you something," the teacher said. I nodded. "Why did you raise your hand that first day?" The question caught me off guard, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I hadn't expected to be asked. I wanted to make sure I understood before it became a problem. She studied me for a moment. "You could have let it go. You could have stayed quiet." "I've tried that before. It doesn't help anyone," I replied. She smiled faintly. "No, it doesn't." She didn't say anything else about it. She didn't need to. When I left the room, I felt lighter, not relieved exactly, but aligned, like something that was off was now sitting where it belonged. At home, the tension followed me in a different form. My cousin was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with my aunt and uncle. His voice was low, urgent. When I walked in, the conversation stopped. My aunt forced a smile. "How is school?" "Fine," I said. My cousin stood abruptly. "I'm going out."
He left without looking at me. That night, I overheard more than I was meant to. Not because I was trying to, but because voices carry when people are emotional. He was frustrated, said the teacher had it out for him, that I'd embarrassed him, that I was plain dumb on purpose. I stayed in my room. I didn't need to defend myself, because this wasn't about school anymore. It was about image, about the version of himself he'd been protecting for years, the confident one, the capable one, the one who didn't ask for help. And that version was cracking. Over the next week, the fallout spread quietly. Grades came back, feedback was given. My cousin's confidence slipped in small ways. Hesitations before answering, glances around the room before speaking. He wasn't being mocked. No one was laughing. They were reassessing. That's harder to deal with. At lunch one day, someone asked me how I figured out the approach I used. It wasn't admiration, just curiosity. "I asked questions," I said. They nodded like that made sense. Across the table, my cousin stayed silent. He stopped correcting people, stopped explaining things no one asked him to explain. He shrank into himself slightly, not out of humility, but out of caution. That's when I realized the betrayal had fully surfaced. It wasn't just that he'd mocked me for asking for help. It was that he'd built his confidence on making sure others didn't. By positioning himself as the one who already knew, he'd made it unsafe for anyone else to admit uncertainty, including me, and now that illusion was gone. One afternoon, he cornered me in the hallway, not aggressively, desperately. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Do what?" I asked. "Make me look stupid." I met his eyes. I didn't. "Yes, you did. You always do this. Act calm like you're better than everyone." I shook my head. "I'm not better. I'm just not pretending." He laughed bitterly. "You think that makes you right?" "No," I said. "I think it makes me honest." He stared at me for a long moment, then walked away. That was the last real conversation we had. After that, things settled, not back to normal, something else, something quieter, more careful. Teachers asked more questions, students answered more thoughtfully. The room felt different, and through it all, I stayed the same. I still asked questions when I needed to, I still listened more than I talked. I didn't take victory laps or correct people unnecessarily, because the point was never to win, it was to change the rules of the room. By the time the teacher called my name again a few weeks later, it wasn't to put me on the spot, it was to ask me to help explain something to the class. No laughter followed, just attention. And as I stood there, speaking calmly, I realized that the revenge I'd stumbled into wasn't loud or dramatic, it was lasting. My cousin had mocked me for asking for help because he thought silence meant weakness. What he learned, too late, was that silence, when chosen, can be power. And once the room understands that, it never really goes back to the way it was before. The change didn't announce itself. It didn't need to. It lived in small moments. The pause before someone laughed, the way questions were asked instead of dismissed, the way people looked around the room before deciding who actually knew what they were talking about. I felt it most clearly when I stopped feeling watched. Not ignored, not underestimated, just seen. My cousin stayed quieter after that, not withdrawn exactly, but measured. He stopped performing confidence and started protecting himself instead. When teachers asked questions, he waited. When he spoke, he chose his words carefully. The certainty he used to wear so easily now felt heavy on him, like something he didn't quite trust anymore. We didn't talk much after that hallway conversation. There was no apology, no resolution wrapped in a neat ending, just distance. Sometimes that's the most honest outcome. At family gatherings, the shift followed us there too. It always does. People don't realize how often behavior transfers between spaces. The same confidence that works in one room tries to survive in another. It didn't. My cousins still told stories, but they were shorter now, less exaggerated. When he made claims, people asked follow-up questions, not aggressively, just enough to matter. He noticed, I could tell. Once, during dinner, someone asked about school. He started to answer for me out of habit, then stopped mid-sentence and looked at me. I answered myself. No one laughed. That moment stayed with me longer than any classroom silence ever had. What surprised me most was how little satisfaction I felt. I'd imagined revenge would feel sharper, more rewarding. But this wasn't about humiliation. It wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about balance. He had built something fragile by mocking others for needing help. I had done something quieter. I had refused to be ashamed of learning. When those two approaches collided, only one of them held up. Over time, people began coming to me with questions, not because I was loud or confident, but because I listened, because I didn't make them feel small for not knowing something yet. I recognized the hesitation in their voices, the fear of being laughed at. I made sure they weren't. That mattered more than being right. One afternoon, my cousin sat a few desks away from me during a test review. He leaned over slightly and hesitated before speaking. "How did you approach the last problem?" he asked. Not sarcastically, not defensively, honestly. I told him. He nodded. Thanks. That was it. No commentary, no jokes, just acknowledgement. In that moment, I realized something important. Revenge doesn't always mean taking something away from someone. Sometimes it means forcing them to confront the part of themselves they've been hiding behind. The version of him that mocked others existed because it had never been challenged, because silence had protected it. Once that silence changed, so did everything else. By the end of the year, the class felt different. Questions were normal. Help wasn't something you earned, it was something you used. Teachers encouraged curiosity openly. The room felt safer. And I understood then that the teacher calling my name that first day hadn't been the moment everything changed, it was the moment everything started being honest. I never told anyone this, but asking for help that day had been a choice. I'd understood the material well enough to get by, but I'd sensed the gap, the place where pretending would eventually fail. I chose to speak there instead. My cousin chose to laugh. Those choices shaped everything that followed. If I'd stayed silent, I would have protected his image and sacrificed my own growth. If I'd snapped back, I would have played into the performance he understood best. Instead, I stayed calm, and that calm did something louder than any comeback ever could. Now, when I think back on it, I don't remember the laughter as much as I remember this silence that came after, the moment when people stopped assuming and started paying attention. That silence didn't belong to me alone. It belonged to the truth finally being allowed into the room. My cousin mocked me for asking for help because he thought strength meant never needing it. What he learned, slowly, quietly, was that real strength is knowing when to ask, when to listen, and when to stop pretending. And what I learned was this: being underestimated isn't always a disadvantage. Sometimes it's the space you need to let people reveal themselves while you're busy becoming exactly who you're supposed to be.